The government doesn't have to suck. It's designed that way as a self-fulfilling prophecy. The belief that government is this Kafkaesque, useless, inefficient nightmare has deep roots in the United States. But undoing this reactionary founding principle is not only possible, but necessary. We're going to trace this through line of anti-government sentiment all the way through American history, from the Puritans to Donald Trump. And after we have a grasp on the past and the present, we are going to imagine a future where government works for the people and does it extremely well. Let's dive into it. So when I say the anti-government has deep roots in the US, I mean it has deep roots. So if you recall, the Puritans came to America because they were fleeing religious persecution. In practice, they had a radical vision for the Church of England, which was still a little too Catholic-y, too much popery for them, and a rather exclusionary expectation that the whole church and country conform to their beliefs. This is what Puritan means, right? Expelling anything that didn't meet their definition of pure Protestant, Calvinist, biblical fundamentalism. This is where we have to start thinking about how we use the term freedom. It's hard to say with any degree of honesty that the Puritans were seeking religious freedom. At least the term freedom is doing a lot of work here, because England, in a sense, did have religious freedom, but they didn't have the freedom to undemocratically change the Church of England however they wanted. What they really wanted was the freedom to make everyone else live according to their expectations. In other words, the freedom to rule according to their theocratic ideals. We will see this theme a lot in the America that they helped to create. So after losing their way and missing Virginia by a few hundred miles, they founded a New England. The colonies they created, like Massachusetts Bay, Connecticut, Rhode Island, were super free. As long as you weren't an Indian, a Catholic, a woman, a child, or propertyless. But for white landowning Puritan men in good standing, it was paradise. So they successfully escaped what they considered to be a repressive government, but that's a generous way of describing what is happening. These people were in reality religious exclusionary extremists. They had to sail across the ocean and steal land from people who were actually free in order to found the free society of their dreams, because their definition of freedom was rather unique. 100 years or so later, we see another development in American anti-government sentiment. The founding fathers, who instigated and led the American War of Independence, had their own grievances with the governments of the old world, and there were legitimate ones. Philosophers like John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Adam Smith were envisioning a world at this time without autocratic kings and burdensome economic systems. This is the era of liberal philosophy, the notion that all, and you have to put in brackets here, white landowning men, but the notion that all men, or all people, if we're being generous, would have equal opportunity and freedom in the law and the market, and no, again in brackets, no white man. No man should be tied to an aristocrat's property as a serf, or forced to sell their wares to a specific country at an uncompetitive price, right? That's what the economic system these guys were working with, was mercantilism, a highly limited market by their parent countries. And think about it from their perspective, why would the old world kingdom send people across the world to farm tobacco and sugar just to sell it to a merchant in Italy, and enriching the colonists who grew the tobacco, but the King of England doesn't see anything. The people of England don't see anything from that, right? So it makes sense how this system came into place. It was becoming clear that the interests of the colonists and the interests of their countries of origin were beginning to diverge significantly. A lot of the founding fathers, like Samuel Adams, were even smugglers, evading the limitations and taxes of the old world countries. Listen to this quote that describes the situation we're dealing with quite well. Two facts respecting the acts of trade had their bearing on later events. First, the colonies, like most frontier agricultural communities, were plainly exploited by the older countries as a source of low-priced raw materials and as a market for manufactured wares. So they're getting cheap resources from the colonists and then selling them the finished products, and the colonists can't sell and buy from people in the Caribbean. Like the molasses for alcohol was a really big deal, and they're just were barriers to trade. And so these guys would smuggle molasses from the Caribbean. To continue this quote, second, widespread law evasion fostered in the colonists a spirit of disobedience and insubordination. This is that smuggling and stuff we're talking about. So the founding fathers didn't seem to have a problem with breaking laws that didn't serve them. Law and order wasn't a big deal to them, apparently. And frankly, they were given a large latitude to do so with a wink and a nod by the officials. And they didn't feel like they should have to pay taxes to a king on the other side of the ocean. Again, their tax burden was relatively low, but the cost of military protection from the British Empire, as the colonists insisted on expanding further west into Indian territory, was also extremely high. But this is what government was to them, right? An antiquated, inefficient limitation on their entitlement to enterprise and progress and expansion. I think it's unfair to say that the government itself was a problem, though, because it would be maybe more accurate to say that the anachronistic feudalist monarchies of Europe had been transcended and had outlived their usefulness. However, many of the founders, though not all, left us with a sense that government itself is a hindrance to human flourishing, and the smaller and weaker the government, the better. But people forget that weak government quickly proved to be an unsustainable foundation for this new country, and the original Constitution, the Articles of Confederation, was replaced within the decade by our current Constitution, because it had no executive power. It was weak and highly decentralized. It couldn't hold all the states together. Centralized systems of power also prevailed, such as professional military and a centralized bank, and these integral developments are much less appreciated in the American consciousness than Thomas Jefferson's idealized form of decentralized republicanism. Another era of American history that left its mark on how government should work was the Gilded Age. But after the Civil War, which was fought over this question of what freedom means again, namely that Southern aristocrats felt they had the freedom to own slaves, a holdover from the old pre-liberal world that suited them. The U.S. ended Reconstruction early and leaned heavily into laissez-faire economics. This freedom of enterprise was a catalyst for building the industries the U.S. needed to become the empire that it is today. It was a vast continent, freshly rusted from the hands of Indians and Mexicans, that needed to build tens of thousands of miles of railroads to connect it. They needed coal, it needed steel, copper ships, steam engines, oil, and most importantly, it needed labor to build the infrastructure that would make it an economic powerhouse. But this feckless and corrupt style of governance was great for millionaires, but the average people tended to suffer as workers, including children, were routinely killed in unsafe working conditions by police or by union-busting Pinkertons, or simply from poverty, as wages were next to nothing. In some cases, people were dependent on company towns, where the company, let's say a mining company, would own everything in the town, from shops to housing, and they would pay workers in a currency that they could only spend at the company shops, which you will not be surprised to hear had highly inflated prices. So they're being paid in a fake currency and then turning around and giving that fake currency right back to the employer in order to have a house and food. John Steinbeck illustrates this company town concept in The Grapes of Wrath as late as the 1930s. If there is no government worth speaking of, who maintains law and order when the companies are the ones corrupting it, right? Who protects the workers from the companies? Eventually, when workers would organize for better conditions, they would be met with violence, such as the Battle of Blair Mountain, where coal miners literally fought a pitched battle, or consider the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire of 1911 as another example of how deadly absolute corporate power can be. The Manhattan factory locked the doors to keep union organizers out, and 146 workers as young as 14 were killed when there was a fire, locked inside in order to prevent union organizers from the radical mission of building a world where workers' lives are worth more than textile production. Only after tragedies, or massacres, I would say, would the dreaded and unaffordable and burdensome regulations be passed to mandate safety measures like fire escapes and fire doors, and not locking people inside of a building. To capital, human life is expendable. Human life is a resource just like coal and cotton are resources. A replaceable resource until mandated by the government to care. Things got so bad after speculation that led to the Great Depression that FDR actually dared to imagine a government that works for people. He used the government to create public works jobs for people that paid a living wage and help the country get back on its feet with infrastructure that it's going to need for this new economy we're building. He created the minimum wage, Social Security, unemployment insurance, because he knew that corporations had too much power over people in the economy. But being motivated only by profit had no incentive to look out for the interests of the people. That's the government's job. So this was unprecedented in American history, a country founded on freedom from government. FDR provided us a vision of government that preserves the freedom of the people from corporations. The freedom to work, the freedom to not work, the freedom to work safely and be paid fairly for that work, and even the freedom to retire. These are not freedoms corporations and the ruling class care to preserve, as proven by their actions in the Gilded Age. Currently, we live in a reactionary era of American history. I think we can safely call the neoliberal era or even a neo-Gilded Age. So if you recall our philosophy discussion, liberalism was the philosophy that prioritized, really honestly at the time, the freedom of property-owning individuals over government encroachment. Well, that class of people has been trying to undo with no small degree of success FDR's reforms like minimum wages and retirement benefits for almost 100 years, but it really picked up with Ronald Reagan and trickle-down economics and all that. Reality is this neoliberal era of policy has created an extremely crafty and effective self-fulfilling prophecy. Cut taxes, yay. Underfund public goods like the post office, schools, transportation, the VA, and social services, and then when those services fail, blame the government, not the policy. This ad I got on my Facebook from the Cato Institute, which is a conservative think tank named after Rome's most famous conservative orator, frames the unprofitability of the post office as a function of government systems a priori. It states clearly that their intention is to privatize it, enriching companies like FedEx and UPS, which are motivated only by profit and don't serve everyone. Some people live in remote areas that are unprofitable to deliver to, and only the post office does it. The post office doesn't have to be profitable. It's a public service that facilitates economic growth. It's an investment. This is why I say government doesn't have to suck. That's a choice our corrupt leaders have made, and like a magician, attempts to conceal the mechanism by which they achieved it. Swooping in to provide the solution, privatize everything. And you can guess who benefits from that, and you can guess who pays the bill in the end. And as a result, again, we are inundated with this message that not only do people not need government to help them, but that it cannot help them. Ronald Reagan unimaginatively quipped, "The 9 most terrifying words in the English language are, 'I'm from the government and I'm here to help.'" Is this the message that people should be hearing from the people elected to serve them? Thanks for electing me. We can't do anything for you. The other day I saw another ad. This one was in opposition to my congressional representative, Greg Landsman, attacking him for not voting for Trump's no tax on tips and overtime initiative. There are many better things to attack Landsman for if one only had the time. But the explicit message here is that Landsman doesn't care about the working class and thinks that you should all pay more taxes. The implicit message is that you shouldn't have to pay taxes. Just like billionaires, you shouldn't have to pay taxes. Paying tax is the government burdening you with nothing in return. But the reality that messaging like this sinisterly obfuscates is that we pay taxes for our collective prosperity. Certainly, taxes in the US mostly fund the building and dropping of bombs on brown people, which is by no means inevitable and needs to change. But taxes also fund crucial public goods like the post office, libraries, schools, roads, air traffic controllers, clean drinking water. They even subsidize your precious gasoline. These expenses are not burdens, except for the gasoline one. They are investments in our communities that provide far greater returns than the S&P 500 ever could. When money and resources are hoarded by the infinitely wealthy, taxing them to fund programs like this redistributes that wealth to the people. We're not talking about taking their money and giving people cash, although in some cases we should be doing that. We're talking about redistributing their money through public goods that benefit every single person benefit every single person. Even if you don't take advantage of a certain public good, you are better off in a society that has that public good. We'll talk more about that. And it is also true that the working class currently shoulders too much of the tax burden and gets too little in return. But that would be a generous interpretation of messaging like these ads from the Cato Institute and Greg Landsman's opponent. This is a calculated message that Republicans have been repeating, even also Democrats, neoliberal politicians have been repeating for 50 years. that taxes are bad and you shouldn't have to pay them. Democrats raise taxes, Republicans lower taxes, so vote for the Republicans. But I think that any notion that this messaging is anything but dishonest manipulation of vulnerable people is incredibly naive. Messages like this, repeated over and over for the last 50 years, train people to ignore the reasons that we have taxes and only consider this simple formula of raising taxes equals bad and lowering taxes equals good. This can also be seen in the current push to abolish property taxes. Mike DeWine has already said that abolishing property taxes could result in like a 20% sales tax to cover the expenses that will still need to be funded. And that is a far more regressive tax that will disproportionately burden the least wealthy people. Not only homeowners, but even more so those who don't have the good fortune of owning property at all, and overwhelmingly will benefit those who own lots of property, like landlords. We deserve so much more than this. Just like two horses together can pull more than two horses combined can pull separately, when people organize and pool their resources, we can accomplish more for less cost per person than if we all try to go it alone. Maybe you don't use the library, but you're better off in a city with libraries. Maybe you don't use the protected bike lane, but you're better off with fewer cars and dead cyclists on the road. I don't have kids in school, but I know that I am better off in a country with educated people who can go and find cures for cancer and develop more efficient engines and protect our biodiversity or teach me about dinosaurs. A better world is possible, and in order to achieve it, we need to reframe government as an institution that provides for the people, protects the freedoms of people, and performs the will of the people. But first, we have to reacquire the ability to imagine a world where government doesn't have to suck.